Greetings, legendary listeners. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel TV. And that means it's time to talk about the jet ski-infested, Amazon and IKEA dissing second episode of Loki titled The Variant. There are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we organize our approach. Instead of jumbling all of our thoughts together into one meandering thread, we divide our analysis of each Marvel TV episode into 3 distinct shows, each with their own unique lens. Pondervision drops every single Saturday during Loki. This is where Jesse Taylor and I explore the most captivating conundrums of the episode, teasing out their implications for the MCU and our own reality. On Monday, our character cast with Christine Kippens will get inside the minds of our favorite characters. I'm talking Loki, Mobius, Renslayer, and of course, the superior variant we just met. But as always, we begin our analysis with this show, our Storycast. This is where we break down the latest episode of Marvel TV, not by plot, but by themes, tropes, genres, and archetypes. This is one of the most original TV analysis shows anywhere, and you can only get it here on the Marvelous TV Club. I am your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. And as always on Storycast, I am joined by our 2 story experts. From the popular website, salon.com, writer Amanda Marcotte. How are you doing, Amanda?
Doing good.
Also with us is the professor of English and director of the Digital Arts and Humanities program at Manhattan College, Dr. Maeve Adams. Welcome, Dr. A.
Thank you for having me. I'm particularly excited to be here because, Professor Loki and I feel like, I don't know,
Yeah.
Professor Loki, Professor Adams, friends.
There's something to it. For all we know,
Something
you're a
to it,
variant.
I know, maybe, we contemplated the possibility that I was evil during WandaVision, and now, who knows?
Now you're just potentially chaos personified. Well, look, in case folks didn't catch it last time, we have a new website, and on it is a bunch of cool merch. So if you are into our Loki logo, please head to the website, marveloustvclub.com, and grab something of your choice, a mug or a t-shirt or a mask, whatever suits you. That'll only be available while Loki is on, so you've got another couple weeks to do that. If there's something that you want there that isn't there, leave a note in a 5-star review, and I will do my best to make it happen. So, I guess before we begin, I'm curious, who here is a fan of jet skiing?
Well, they'd hate it if I said this, but I'm going to say it anyway. My people are rednecks, so of course I'm a fan of jet skiing. ATVs and all other things that go loud and fast.
I see. And you've been jet skiing, I guess. Not with me, you haven't, so you've been.
Yes, I have been jet skiing. Got badly sunburned as well while jet skiing and fell off the jet ski, and it was so much fun.
Maeve, have you ever been jet skiing?
I have done lots of water sports of the conventional kind, like water skiing, swimming, diving. I was on the diving team for a hot minute, like literally a hot minute. I got kicked off after a day. I don't know why. It wasn't bad, but I have never jet skied. And I lament that because I think that they sound pretty cool and they sound fun. And, I like fun.
It's going to come up. It has to come up. It was the essentially opening of Loki's first scene. And then we got another conversation about it. So I'm excited to see how jet skis fit into our topics today, because as you all might expect, we're going to explore 2 primary themes of this episode of Loki, one from each of our experts. We'll talk about the moments in the episode that tied into the theme, and of course, we'll discuss works of literature and film that are closely related. Last week, you might recall, Maeve talked about the movie Brazil, and there was a big interview with Kate Herron, the director, this week, in which she specifically referenced how important Brazil was to her design. So if you ever listen to Storycast and think like, hey, do these related works, do they really matter? Do they really influence the MCU? Yes, the answer is always yes. They are all watching and reading and thinking about these things as they create them. So that's what Storycast is here for, to kind of take you in a reverse deconstruction of all of these ideas and bring them back out from the viewer side. So let's get into it. We're going to begin today with Amanda. Amanda, is there a main idea or theme that you saw as driving this episode of Loki?
So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of versus type themes because of the Owen Wilson, Tom Hiddleston chemistry. This particular week, it is chaos versus order. And in a sense, it's chaos versus order, but I feel like actually the kind of nut of the episode was arguing that chaos and order are a yin and yang. They're entwined and part of each other and cannot be separated so easily. They need each other. You know, like boobs and bra.
Okay, so which one is chaos? I guess the boobs.
I guess boobs. Yeah.
Yeah. So boobs are Loki and bras are Mobius, which I think, you know, if you've ever worn a bra, the Mobius strip analog actually feels about right.
Right, because it's always kind of twisted somehow, but never quite. It doesn't work the way you expect. There's always some kind of weird loop in it. That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, boobs are chaos, but I feel like there's been an anti-bra thing since the pandemic started, which people seem to be in support of. So I guess Loki is winning in the boobs v bra thing. Maeve, you're making a face. Where do you stand on this
I'm just
analogy?
trying to I'm just mapping out boobs, bra, on.
Is Amanda pouring salt into your salad right now?
I like a lot of salt, so I was like, ooh, that's probably making the salad more delicious.
Right up until he poured milk all over it.
Yeah, what was that? Was that like coconut milk or something? I couldn't make out what was in that box.
Coconut water. It was like a watery, milky substance. Yeah, I don't know, because I'm thinking like boobs are nature, bra is nurture,
Well, we didn't get a lot of boobs and bra talk in the episode. So, Amanda, why don't you tell us if there's a key scene or a thread that really crystallized this theme or idea for you while you were watching?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, and as I said before, that we're going to get a lot of discussions between Loki and Mobius where they're kind of using the classic two detectives who are opposites of each other, that you see from everything from, it's like True Detective. It's like every detective story. Having these kinds of philosophical discussions as a place where these themes are going to get articulated often pretty bluntly. We saw a lot of discussion between Mobius and Loki throughout the episode where they talked about kind of who was in control of who. And I think that gets to the concept of order versus chaos, which is they both need each other. They cannot be separated. You can't have one without the other. So who's manipulating who? Well, they're both manipulating each other. Who's in charge of who? One is in charge, the other's in charge. It's a Mobius strip, right? It's a true tug of war. I think also the jet skis conversation, like you said, was extremely important to this. Mobius says, and it's comical, it's like a bra or a jet ski, right? Is this kind of, he calls it, I do believe, a beautiful union of form and function. And I think what the jet ski symbolizes as the beautiful union of chaos and order. The jet ski is a marvel of engineering. It is pulled together in a very orderly way, but what you use it for is a form of fun that is basically chaotic. If you've ever driven one, they're just like bouncing around on the waves. You're lucky if you can hang on. Your desire to go in any one direction is defeated by the sort of natural order of the waves. So I think that the jet ski was really very much a symbol of that.
You mentioned the fun of the jet ski and its kind of chaotic nature with respect to the waves. One of the things I'm remembering now, because I said that, I enjoy water sports of the conventional kind. So I used to water ski a lot. And the thing that was really annoying about jet skis is that they would create wake behind them, like really disordered wake. And it's really hard to do on a body of water when there's a ton of wake is water ski because you can't move smoothly through water. So yeah, it is kind of chaos, but as you say, a feat of engineering that allows someone to navigate, what is otherwise a large expanse of water, to kind of take control of the water and dominate it with your kind of bro-ish vroom, vroom.
But those waves are, if anything, such a perfect symbol of the variance. And I think, the variant language was really tied to chaos. heavily in this episode. In fact,
Yeah.
I do believe Mobius calls variants chaotic energy or chaotic aberrations or something of that nature.
Yeah.
But they are chaos, and they're a wave, a powerful wave that breaks across time space in the way that a jet ski leaves a wake that causes problems. But, I would point out that Loki's kind of argument for chaos and his argument for himself is that you need that too. And you can tell at times that Mobius is drawn to it, not in no small part because he's drawn to jet skis, which are a symbol of chaos.
Yeah, and fun, right? Like what you said before, because Loki repeatedly throughout this episode also talks about things that are boring and things that are fun as an alternative, because order is without chaos, as you're suggesting, without a little bit of chaos, you sort of injected into the world or our experience of it, it's simply boring. And, then you're not going to watch the training videos.
I think it's not a coincidence that this theme was also played out against a backdrop of theme of apocalypse, because what you get with the tension between order and chaos is if you tilt too far into either direction, you end up in nihilism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chaos without order is just a churning blackness that there's no meaning to it. It's just destruction. And in fact, we see that with the hurricane tearing down this town. We see that with the volcano wiping out Pompeii. That is a symbol of chaos unleashed. But the TVA is a symbol of order going too far. It's stifling. It destroys the human spirit. It destroys, that sense of fun and unpredictability that makes life worth living. And Mobius is a big believer in order. He continually tries to insist that Loki is a predictable person, that Loki, even the symbol of chaos himself, is predictable. Oh, you stab somebody in the back 50 times. You're history's most predictable liar. Like, he is such a believer in order that he just actually continues to deny that chaos is real.
Yeah.
But obviously it's real because it's his job to stifle it.
Right. What is the point of Mobius's job if variants don't exist? There is no Mobius. And in fact, there may be another Mobius. He's very jealous of Renslayer's other analyst, and I wouldn't be surprised to find out that it's just another copy of this particular person. Certainly in the comics, there are multiple copies of Mobius running around anyway. Yeah, hearing you talk about this, Amanda, I'm also thinking about that lunch scene because the food was so pathetic. That salad was tiny and kind of limp. The only spices were salt and pepper. And the Josta, that's all he drinks. And look, I mean, I like a Diet Coke. It's not like I ever get tired of it. But if that's all I ever had to drink, I'd go slightly insane. So yeah, Mobius does seem to be trying to stay inside his box as much as possible.
And there's a real question about whether Loki is as predictable. I think we learned pretty swiftly that Loki is not as predictable as Mobius thinks he is. For one thing, Loki doesn't predict what Loki's going to do.
Right.
Loki predicts all this stuff about the Loki they're chasing. And then when they finally get to that Loki is female. But I think that that's not even like the surprising part. What was really surprising about that Loki is that Loki does not have the motivations that Loki feels a Loki would have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whether it's Loki is a really good question. We may talk about that a little bit. I don't know how much we wanted to get into that on Storycast, but yeah. Anyway, keep going. What were you saying about her?
Well, for story purposes, we'll just say she is Loki right now, and the he/she is very helpful in distinguishing them. She is not what he wants her to be.
Yeah.
She laughs in his face when he suggests that she would take down the TVA because that's what he would do.
Rule the TVA, though, actually, to your point, right? Like, what she rejects is the idea of ruling the TVA, which is an orderly idea. And she instead wants to bomb the TVA and all of the timelines, which is much more of a chaos idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back to, I think, the discussion we had last week and during the preview about whether or not this particular Loki even is a chaos agent like he thinks he is, or if he is a lawful evil.
Yeah. I mean, he's pretty good at aping the TVA, right? There's that moment where they go back to the Ren Fair, the Renaissance Fair, and they're trying to find the variant, and he's, gone with them. And then he basically pretends to be the agent of order in that tent. And he does it really effectively. He says, where I see scheme, I see me. And then right after that, he offers up some adage about wolf, what was it? Something about like
the wolf's ears and the wolf's teeth.
Right, exactly. And, the thing about cliches and adages is that they are ordering agents for chaotic events, always, right? Like a stitch in time saves 9, right? Like they're ordering principles, they're ways of understanding and making sense of a world where things go awry, right? So he of course puts on the persona of the detective that is solving a case, of fixing a problem, of telling them, what to expect. So he's really good at it, right? He's got this, and yes, obviously in that scene, or at least what he says to us at the end of the episode is that he's trying to trick them, right? He's trying to become a double agent, basically. But he also knows how to perform the work of ordering for his own purpose or whatever. But, the point is that he has that inside of, he's got some capacity for that.
Was it on the show or was it in just text message? I can never remember sometimes. Where I said that Owen Wilson's performance of Mobius is clearly, in my view, owes a lot to Tommy Lee Jones in No Country for Old Men.
No, I have not heard that from you, so I would like to hear more.
Well, I don't know. He's given me that vibe. It might just be a Texas thing, but I think that movie is very much along the lines of the order-based detective just being defeated by chaos. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's necessarily what this story's about, but it's that is so sewn into detective stories going back to the beginning of detective stories. And I think that they're really kind of playing it up in this episode.
Yeah.
What does it say about this order versus chaos thing that the male Loki seems to be the one that is doing things like trying to take over the TVA and is somewhat predictable, though not all the time for sure. He's, like you said, he certainly didn't know what he was going to do in Pompeii. But what does it say that the order version of Loki is a little bit more, is masculine, and the one who's pulling off the big plan is feminine?
Well, not to sound like Jordan Peterson here.
Please don't do that. Yes.
I'm really excited / terrified right now. Keep going.
No, seriously. He's a monster and a fascist.
Yeah.
But it is true that traditionally the feminine is seen as more chaotic than the masculine. He just seems to think that that's a prescriptive value instead of just a patriarchal stereotype.
You mean Jordan Peterson thinks that?
Yeah, Jordan Peterson thinks that. I would say, however, in this episode, it's being turned on its head. We have a lot of language about who's the superior Loki. Is it the one that's chasing or the one that's being chased? And the male Loki insists in this very impotent way throughout the episode that he's the superior Loki. But at the end, he clearly understands that it's pointless to even argue this because the female Loki is clearly the superior one because she is more of a god of mischief.
Yeah, she definitely...
He's a fascist.
Yeah, she definitely didn't want... He wanted to take control of the system and she wanted to tear it down, right?
But according to you, I mean, I have a question for you, Amanda, because I'm fundamentally persuaded by your argument that we need both chaos and order, right? That and then that's not just a conservative narrative that we need order to come in and, save us from revolutionary chaos or whatever. I think that there's some truth to that idea. So if that is true, then perhaps Loki is the superior, or that's my question. Is Loki, in your mind, the superior Loki because he gets something that it seems that this, Loki variant or Sylvie or whatever we're going to call her, doesn't get?
I guess there's a real interesting paradox in there, right? Because she's the superior Loki if you assume the Loki etymology, I'd say. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Or genealogy or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, where the Lokis exist to be chaos agents. So the order of the universe is that Loki is the chaos agent that we need in order for the universe to work. So his place in the order is to be chaotic. So by that measure, she's a superior Loki because she's more chaotic. Not that she's superior by any abstract measure, but by fits the role of chaos agent.
Of the Loki. Yeah.
I mean, I think I could make some arguments in her favor. I mean, certainly her magic of being able to possess people while also still separately moving around and being an independent moving person, that's way beyond anything this Loki can do. So that's a point in her favor. She is less predictable than this Loki. And while predictability isn't a bad thing necessarily, we repeatedly see male Loki seen through all the time by pretty much everybody, including her. And her plan isn't really known by anybody until the second that they pull it off. On top of that, she wanted them there, which means this Loki, our Loki, finding her was not something where he bested her, but rather he merely stepped into her trap. So I don't know. I feel like there's pretty strong textual evidence that Lady Loki / Sylvie is the superior one. And if people are wondering where that Sylvie thing is coming from, just in case you hadn't seen this, in one of the credits for the international voiceovers, they name the character Sylvie. Most of them label it as the variant, which is how she is labeled in, I think, the English credits. But the Castilian Spanish one had her labeled with the name Sylvie. If you're curious about who that might be, feel free to Google that. There's a ton of stuff out there already. But we might just refer to her occasionally as Sylvie. So since that was in the credits, but we won't go too deep on the potential theories. I might save some of that for some of the other shows. But anyway, I think she is, I think, the more advanced Loki, in my opinion. I come down on that side for sure.
She's superior, not in a moral sense or any other sense. She's just the more Loki of Lokis.
She's like more archetypal, maybe.
She might know more about the TVA too. Loki. Let's not forget what, the kidnapped time agent C20 said, right? Was real, it's real, it's real. That means there's something that this Loki has shown C20 that, had an impact. And so, I don't know, it feels like this Loki might have a bit more of the picture of what's going on. And maybe that doesn't make her superior exactly, but certainly her game is more advanced as well. That's kind of where I'm at. So let's talk about some works of literature and film, Amanda, that you think influence this theme of order and chaos. What might they have drawn on in this episode's theme?
Well, what's kind of cool about this is that what immediately came to mind was the myth of Ragnarok itself. Which we talked about some last episode, but I think is worth delving into a little bit more deeply here. And this is true generally of a lot of religions around the world, pagan and monotheistic, that they have a creation myth and an apocalyptic myth, and the two sit in tension with each other, where creation so apocalypse is kind of the chaos taking over order, right? And creation is order being imposed on chaos. And in the biblical Genesis, you have God literally taking the kind of unformed mass of the universe and shaping it, turning it animals and people and planets and oceans, right? And in the Norse mythology of Ragnarok, what I think is really interesting about it is that it's explicitly cyclical. And I think this is true of a lot of religions. I think of Hinduism and things like that as well. But in Norse mythology, the idea is that the world is constantly being created and destroyed, and that it happens over and over again. And in fact, the destruction of Ragnarok, which is explicitly described in a lot of the myths about it as chaos kind of overwhelming the order that the gods imposed on earth and killing all the gods and laying waste to all of creation. And then from the waste that was laid, like a forest that has been burned down, grows the new order, the new creation. Yeah. So you cannot have creation without destruction in these kinds of mythologies. You cannot have order without chaos. Chaos is cleansing, order is building, and they kind of work together. And it makes sense. That's also the cycle of life. You're born, you die, but you give birth, or at least some of us do,
I was going to say, well,
to the people that replace us.
Yeah. And, even the kind of the conception of, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, right, in the Christian, Christological mythology is about that. So it's not just about like reproduction, but it's also about the way in which we feed that cycle of, we think of it as a cycle of life, but I think you're right. It's a cycle of chaos and order, right? It's the Noah story, right? The cleansing of a chaotic universe and a rebuilding. In Hindu mythology, it's also the figure of Kali, who is a kind of prime example of what you're talking about, because she is both creator and destroyer, right? So she contains in her the kind of complementarity of chaos and order, creation and destruction and creation, those kind of twin halves of creation mythologies.
Well, and even the atom itself is kind of an interesting tension between these two things. You have the nucleus, which is this very orderly combination of neutrons and protons. And then you have the electrons, but they're actually so unpredictable as to not be able to be placed in any given spot at any given time, right? There's this sort of uncertainty about that at any given time. So we are all held together by this same tension.
And, if you're into gardening, as I am, I think you can really see how agricultural societies really develop this idea, because you fertilize the ground with chaos, you compost, and everything just sort of decays into this chaotic mess, and out of it grows new plants and new life. So it's everywhere that you look. And it's interesting to me that the Norse mythology of Ragnarok, which is very explicit about chaos versus order, the cycle of life, how these two are wed together, and often Loki's role in that in mythology is kind of being brought onto this show. It does make me think they really studied their actual Norse mythology when they decided to write Loki a character.
Well, surely this is a theme where creators have had some fun with it, Amanda. Give me some work of literature or film that had a good time with order versus chaos.
Well, it's kind of everywhere when you start to look at it, but I think hilariously, the most fun example in American culture is if it's any teen movie, any movie where teenage rebellion is celebrated. You're looking at Footloose, you're looking at Dirty Dancing, you're looking at the Ramones movie, Rock and Roll High School, you're looking at Grease. Hairspray, which, also kind of brings some themes of racial justice in there. It's such a kind of iconic story. We tell it over and over again. And chaos is associated with youth. It's associated with sexuality, but it's associated with these young people tearing down the order that has been imposed on them excessively by adults.
Well, I have two thoughts off that list. One is I actually looked up whether the Franklin D. Roosevelt High School, the pen that the judge had that Mobius commented on, was the high school in Rock and Roll High School. Sadly, it was not.
Oh,
that was Vince Lombardi High School. But I was like, if they actually called that out, that would have been amazing, because they directly called out one of the movies you just named, Amanda, Footloose, right? The song Holding Out for a Hero is the fourth track on that album and came out on that soundtrack first. That, I think, is no coincidence that they are calling their shot and pointing to Footloose as perhaps one of the ultimate stories of chaos versus order.
Yeah.
Yeah, that scene had so many layers of irony. I can't even unpeel them all. Like, I mean, the song is very like, I need a hero. And then it's he.
Yeah.
And of course we find out.
Streetwise Hercules.
Yeah, we find out pretty quickly that the Loki that is driving that scene is not a he at all.
Yeah. It's funny because that song, it's one of my favorite songs. I mean, who doesn't want to sing along to that song, as we've just demonstrated? But, it's such a funny song in the context of this episode and the show, because, it's a world without gods, right? I need a streetwise Hercules. And as if the introduction of a kind of domineering figurehead or authority is the kind of order that's necessary. And of course, the episode subverts that a little bit, right? By suggesting that there is some value in a different kind of chaos, a different kind of order. I mean, at least this episode and the last one, their sort of obsession with that dystopian, bureaucratic ordering that's oppressive, like borderline fascistic, right? There is something in here that's suggesting the beginning of a question around what it would look like if we created a world that was driven by the kind of chaos of Loki and the kind of order of Mobius, who's also a little bit seduced by Loki, right?
Like, yeah.
Yeah, which I love.
And defending him at every turn when Loki's not around, right? To Renslayer, he's going through his process in order to make way for the chaos in a lot of ways, right? Getting the sign off on Loki to go to Pompeii, where then Loki surprises him and frustrates him. But that's what he's signing up for. That's what he's asking her to sign off on.
Yeah.
If I can throw it back to one other Gen X movie, I'll also point out that, Beverly Hills Cop is a bit of a procedural. And this episode was about the procedural in a lot of ways. But Ravonna, the judge, plays the doubting lieutenant, right? Mobius would be Judge Reinhold's character, Rosewood. And B-15 is Taggart, that salty older cop that was with them. And here's the thing. Eddie Murphy's character, Axel Foley, is the guy who put the banana in the tailpipe. If that's not some Loki shit, I don't know what is. That whole movie is about solving crimes and how you need both the rigor and orderliness of detectives, which you talked about on Character Cast last week, but also you need some of that creativity and unpredictability that comes from Axel Foley's character. So I'm pretty sure Kate Herron and Michael Waldron had Beverly Hills Cop on their vision board for this show.
Well, I know that Kate Herron is a huge 80s movies fan. She, Sex Education, her show on Netflix is...
Love that show.
So good, but it very... I don't even know what you would call it. Like, it's not anachronistic. It's literally... The version of that's a cultural thing because she imposes all these American things on English culture that aren't actually there. And they're all things from 80s teen movies. Again, with the teen movies, which like Footloose and stuff like that. She clearly loves that. And I wouldn't be surprised if she also is a fan of all Eddie Murphy movies where he is a trickster who is there to upend the social order, of which Beverly Hills Cop is just one.
Well, enough of the 80s. Maeve, I want a highfalutin answer to this question. Something related to this theme of order. I'm coming to you as the Professor Loki of this podcast. Is there something that relates to this idea that we could think of that would make us sound smart and not just cool?
Look, I'm here for sounding cool. But, I don't know. Professor of English Literature would probably tell you that, one of Shakespeare's comedies, I don't know, specifically Twelfth Night was something that I was thinking about when I was thinking about, as we were talking about order and chaos. I mean, it's a story like many of his comedies about the subverting or the inversion of the social order where, there's a lot of tricksterness in that. And, poor characters, powerless characters get a lot of power, but by the end of the play, all order is restored by the reintroduction of the aristocracy. And the re-empowerment of the aristocracy. It's fairly typical of Shakespeare, but very, very clear in Twelfth Night. But Twelfth Night is a telling comp in this context because Twelfth Night is a story about carnival, about a time of carnival. And we've talked on this podcast about, and specifically about Loki as an example of the carnivalesque, right? So this is a very medieval and Renaissance tradition of a time of a fair or a carnival where the poor get to dress up as the aristocracy and get to boss around the aristocracy, right? So this also makes really relevant that opening scene at a Renaissance fair.
Of course.
And, Renaissance fairs are always about carnivalesque moments. They're always about, fair time, carnival time. And so I think there's something fun about that as an entry point to the episode that they did their homework when they wrote this show, right? Like they really got it. They really got that this would be a kind of perfect and slightly obtuse reference, but, of that combination of chaos and order where, of course, order reinstates itself.
Yeah. And in every Shakespearean comedy, and in fact, you could make the argument that romantic comedies in general are about invoking chaos for the comic value, which also is about sexuality. And then it is brought to order in the end with the marriage. Like that's kind of the standard plot structure of any classic romantic comedy.
No, that's smart. That's really smart. And Jane Austen does that beautifully in her new variations of that in the early 19th century, where she's being really ironic about how marriage doesn't, in fact, solve all the problems of, the chaos that's introduced by like the Elizabeth Bennets of the world. But
so you're saying in a game of fuck, marry, kill, you fuck Loki, you marry Mobius, and kill the timekeepers, I guess.
I mean, I'm definitely killing the timekeepers. Yeah, probably. I feel like, that's probably it. Although I will say, we are not apologists for aristocracy on this podcast. Like, we're not sitting here being like, but aristocracy is so good because it really does return order to the universe. Nope.
Yeah, we're not into
Hard
that.
no.
I'd be surprised if anyone's taking that away from our shows to date. All right, so order versus chaos, that's our first theme, especially borne out in these conversations throughout the entire episode by Loki and Mobius. The jet skis themselves are a fascinating marriage of these two concepts. The feminine Loki and the masculine Loki are an interesting juxtaposition of these two concepts. And the language around everything from the variants to the timekeepers to the way the hurricane is tearing at this store, which is the very epitome of order itself. All of these things tie in. And of course, if you're looking for that same energy, you can find that in any teen movie like Rock and Roll High School, Footloose, Dirty Dancing.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right. I'm into it in Beverly Hills Cop and some of these other procedurals where you get the wacky cop. Lethal Weapon basically does the same thing, right? The by-the-book guy and the wild card are out there solving crimes. That's pretty iconic shit. But then, to sound smart, you can always reference 12th Night, which the show seems to be doing by invoking the Ren Fair itself. In that case, let's move on to our second theme. Maeve, what's the main idea or theme you saw as driving this episode?
So one of the themes that really stuck out to me was the idea that ideology determines reality. All the way throughout the episode, we have characters and figures and ideas that are being reality tested, right? Are these things real, or are they just the things that we believe in, right?
Yeah.
So we've got this conversation between Mobius and Loki, right? That begins with a conversation about the jet ski. Fun, right? Yeah. And then shifts into something super serious about how they know who they are, what's real, and how that all determines their purpose in the world, right? Like, oh, you're, who created you, right? So,
how ridiculous it sounds that you're born of, a frost giant and raised by the god of the heavens or whatever.
So the jet ski itself is a really good example because it's an ideological thing for Mobius, but he has no experience in the real world of a jet ski.
Yeah. He sees it represented in a text. Is it real? Is it not real? Is the only way to make it real that I go and ride a jet ski, which would violate everything that I believe is real? Because that's what he says, right? He's like, does the TVA exist? Do the Time Lords exist? If I believe it's real, it's real. Right. And of course, for Mobius, this is necessary, right? He's got to believe it for it to be real, because the moment he begins questioning whether they exist, whether they have all the power in the universe, whether or not they get to determine reality, right? Everything starts to fall apart. And that brings me to my second scene that I think is really fascinating in this context. And that's the conversation between Mobius and Ravonna Renslayer. So before this, there's that conversation in her office where she says, timekeepers decree reality. And Mobius says to her, I've never met them. Now, I think throughout this episode, we've had moments where Mobius has clearly been influenced by Loki, or maybe he's just always a critical thinker, right? The person who's like, are these things I've been told to believe real, or are they driven by a kind of ideology that is controlling, that is meant to kind of repress difference, repress variance, for example. And one of the things I love about this episode from an aesthetic perspective is that it gets us to think about ideology, the things we believe, as a kind of knee-jerk thing, and asks us to be more critically minded about them. And it does this because the entire episode, except for when they're outside the Time Variance Authority, everything inside the Time Variance Authority is thoroughly claustrophobic, far more claustrophobic than the last episode. The ceilings are really low. The walls are really close. The wood is really dark, right? In Ravonna's office. All the windows in the Time Variance Authority, they don't look out anywhere.
Right. It's always inside into deeper into the time variance authority.
Or they're covered up, or there are no windows, right? So that scene where Mobius and Loki are having this conversation about if I believe it, it's real, right? There are no windows there. Everything is very samey. Ceilings are super low. Ravona's office, there's a shade on her window. The only windows where we see out, we see into, right? So when we look out into this kind of Jetsons universe, anytime we're in a hallway where, we can see the timekeepers and that giant kind of Soviet style statue, we're just looking into a space, not out
and
into a space.
Even in Pompeii, Loki says, I'm from the future. And then he's like, well, am I from the future? Actually, where is the time variance authority exactly? And Mobius gives no answer.
Yep.
So if I may check this concept against a real world example that I think most listeners would be familiar with, it's a big debate we've had over the past 20 years in this country when the idea that same-sex marriage could be real first started to kind of hit the popular consciousness. There was a huge reaction from conservatives who were like, no, marriage is between a man and a woman.
Right.
And it was stated as reality, as a fact, like it was gravity, as a fact, like
yeah.
And things changed because more people said, "Is it though, or is that just what we have collectively decided is true?"
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's funny you say this because, when I was watching this episode, thinking about all these moments where we've got characters thinking about what is real, what's the relationship between my conception of reality and belief. Last episode, I talked about Max Weber and Max Weber's conception of bureaucracy, but there's another contemporary 19th century sociologist who really digs into this. In fact, makes some of our thinking about this possible, right? Like, whatever, we might have been able to think about this stuff, but the person I'm thinking of is Emil Durkheim, who is this 19th century sociologist who comes up with this idea that, and he's trying to figure out how we study society. How do we, study the things that make up human cultures and civilizations? And one of his sort of really important interventions is he says that social reality, which we conceive of as our reality, is a product of shared belief systems that coordinate social life, that determine social life, that constitute social life. It's not just the idea of social construction, right? Like that all these things are fantasies and fictions and that none of them are real. What he says is some of them are facts.
Well, that's a misconstruing of social construction.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But, there are some social constructivists who really bend in that direction, that everything is just a fiction, right? But that's I think you're right. Like, I'm much more persuaded by Durkheim on this. Basically what he says is some of these things are facts, some of these things are fictions, but they determine our social experience when we believe deeply in them. Your example is a really good one, Amanda. There's another example, namely that, for example, patriarchal society, right, is rooted in at least two, tons of them, but at least two beliefs. One, that women are biologically different with respect to men. That's kind of superficially true. It's not a falsehood.
Yeah.
It's superficially true, right? Another belief is that men are superior to women. That's just made up, right? But both of those beliefs that we share with one another are the things that make our social reality and make that reality the reality that we know, that we operate in, that we live in, that we walk around the world behaving according to.
I think when people get into this kind of discussion about social construction, it's so often talked about around things that people are being critical of that we often forget how much of it is just actually benign.
Yeah.
And the example I always point to is money. Yeah. Money is socially constructed. Money also rules people's realities in this way like almost no other concept, that actually if human beings disappeared tomorrow, there would be no biological reality that is money because it only exists because we believe in it.
Yeah. And in fact, we're finding new ways to test that all the time, right? People believe in Bitcoin having value, and now it has value. GameStop is a worthless company whose stock went through the roof just because a bunch of people assigned it value, which is not, it's different than money in that there's a centralized force, which is a government that tends to be doing these things, etc. But it's still interesting that we're able to push the boundaries of what it means to be money simply based on belief.
And men are not naturally superior to women.
Well, I mean, I don't know about all that. I mean, I'm a better driver, and I'm so calm all the time, and
not hysterical.
But it is true that if you live in a sexist society, your life is constructed along the lines as if that were true. Especially, try to vote in 1890 if you're a woman, and tell me how much your belief that men and women are equal serves you.
Yeah. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which this is important for us in the modern world to think about, right? To the extent to which our social reality is determined by these shared beliefs. And one of the things that Durkheim says is that it's not reducible, right? Like the point of studying social reality and understanding reality in these terms is that it doesn't matter what some individual thinks, right? What matters is the stuff that the shared collective thinks, because it also determines purpose. And that's what I think is also at the heart of this episode, is that Loki is trying to push Mobius, and Mobius is trying to push Loki, but maybe more on the first side, to think about why you do what you do. Why do you do what you do, right? Why do you prop up this fundamentally really oppressive / fascistic arrangement of power in the world? You do it because you believe this thing in this really hollow way, that you just go along to get along. You do what you do because you believe, if you believe it's real, it's got to be real. And that is dangerous. And it's dangerous in the way that you mentioned at the beginning of this, Amanda, that if we sit around and we're like, well, gay marriage can't happen because it's not real. Okay, if I just walk away from the conversation about that, deciding that is the moral or good way to be in the world, then I have fundamentally failed my fellow citizens, a huge percentage of my fellow citizens.
Interestingly, Mobius and Loki's discourse about this is a mirror image of what it was in the last episode, where Mobius spent the entire episode questioning and being the skeptic to Loki's self-conception as being born to be the king, having to sort of, and he basically just wrestles Loki through the kind of Socratic method a bit into admitting that it was an illusion he propped up to create power in the world, which of course again is another way that the show is pointing out how reality is socially constructed.
Yeah.
And to come back to that conversation between Mobius and Ravonna Renslayer, the judge that you talked about, Maeve, when she talked about how the timekeepers were so mad and they'd never been so involved or whatever, I was struck by the fact that she seemed to me to be kind of making that up to suit her needs. I don't know how real these timekeepers are. I felt all the way until C20 confessed that she had told this Loki how to find the timekeepers, that they were totally fake, just complete fictions, but maybe there's something to them. Even so, I remain skeptical that Ravonna Renslayer is doing anything other than invoking them to suit her own ends, to construct a reality for the Mobiuses in front of her.
Yeah, I mean, there's no suggestion in this episode or the last that there's anything benevolent about the timekeepers. Regardless of the fact that Ravonna is constantly being like, well, they dictate the timeline and I dictate the dictation of the timeline dictation, like there's always a circular logic. And one thing I will say about Mobius in this episode that, speaks a little bit to what Amanda was saying earlier, is that he's clearly influenced by Loki in that moment, in that scene, in that super claustrophobic office filled with law journals. There's a name for these, which are basically just contain all the case law that can be printed. I spent an entire summer doing research for a lawyer where I had to like read these things. They're like incredibly small print on onion paper.
Yeah.
Like it's this ridiculous conception that there is a way to order the universe according to law, right? So like we're in this office with all of that, and and Mobius says to her, "But could Loki change?" Question mark, right? Mobius has shifted the way that he thinks about the determinacy of the timeline. I mean, because what else, right? Like what else has happened, right? It's got to be because of Loki, right?
I have a question for you then, because I think one of the most crux issues in this episode is Loki's realization that if you go to a spot in time right before an apocalypse, it can be a small one, it can be a large one, it can be a whole planet or just a town. But in there's a piece of time where these kinds of rules don't apply, where you can just construct reality however you want, and because empirically everything gets wiped out immediately, it just doesn't matter. How does this kind of, do you think, fit into your theme?
That's a tricky question, because one of the things that happens in apocalyptic moments, and we've all lived through them from afar or at closer distance, is that all the rules disappear. Mm-hmm. So I lived in New York during 9/11. My parents and my sister have lived in California in the midst of these multiple fires burning down their towns. What happens is that people come together and they stop thinking about the standard hierarchies of daily life. And they give each other things and enact kindness in ways that they would never do. And they return to worlds where they don't do that, right? Like New York has become as unequal as it ever was. It's not like anything has fundamentally changed because we found moments to kind of come together. So essentially what happens is that ideology gets suspended in these moments.
It becomes about the empirical threat, the thing that nobody can deny anymore. That hurricane is not up for debate.
Yeah. It's a reality that's going to destroy your reality. And so suspend everything but human care. And so there is something that tugs at the way we understand how ideology determines reality in those moments, because ideology doesn't determine reality there. It's the fucking hurricane or the fire or the terrorist or whatever it is that is about to destroy your reality.
I think that there's a long fascination in human imagination with that moment before you die.
Yeah.
And an apocalypse, I think, is a symbol of that, where we imagine that the person that's about to die is stripped away of all illusions and left facing reality. I don't think that's true. But what's funny is you see people imposing an ideological agenda on it, like saying they come to Jesus before they die or whatever. But like that idea that right before you die, all that shit just falls away.
Or the alternative, which is that you become more ossified in your commitments.
It's probably more true, but like the fantasy is that.
Yeah, the fantasy is that thing that you see your whole life, spread out before you, and you have the opportunity to at least think in a more moral way. It's like the Christmas Carol story that like, I'm going to show you your death and then you be a better person. I mean, I don't know. A lot of older people become more ossified in their beliefs, become more conservative. Like I just have a hard time believing that like death is going to change everything and make you kinder or something. Maybe it does.
But as a literary symbol, it's kind of cool to imagine that for the 5 minutes before the volcano goes off in Pompeii, it's just a free parking spot on Monopoly, right?
It is an interesting idea, but I do think this notion that the apocalypse strips away the ideology that Maeve mentioned is a really interesting one. It certainly shows a little bit more about who you are. You're the person who's going to like take a risk to help a neighbor, or are you going to pull up the rope when you're worried about your own ass? It's an interesting thing to ponder. Amanda, you cover the real world all the time, and I feel like we're in an interesting time when it comes to determining reality. How does this theme manifest in our lives?
So when Maeve first brought up this theme, I couldn't think of any kind of literature because all I could think about was QAnon. And because it is the most extreme example of the way that ideology forces reality. And it may just be that I was listening to the Vox podcast and they were interviewed a QAnon believer, and just listening to the way that reality always had to bend to the ideological belief that Donald Trump was a good person.
Yeah.
And QAnon is interesting because it's so ridiculous. I think we're all fascinated by it because it's so ridiculous. But it shows the extent to what Maeve is saying about how there's this tendency to sort of have the belief and shape reality around it. And the belief, of course, is that Donald Trump is a good person. The harder and harder it becomes to justify that belief based on empirical evidence, the more and more ridiculous QAnon theories get. Like, as far as they're concerned, half the world is pedophiles. They're all about to come down because Donald Trump is going to pull some kind of magic rope and like the Wizard of Oz, and it's suddenly going to happen, right? And except that they're going to be exposed instead of the mean old sad man that is Donald Trump.
Wait, it's like the rapture?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, remember all the theories around Inauguration Day that Joe Biden was going to get arrested, remember? And Donald Trump would be reinstalled. None of that happened. And
some of them now believe that Joe Biden is a fake and that Trump is actually Joe Biden. I mean,
maybe he's a robot, guys. Maybe he's a robot, like those dogs at the end of the episode.
But there's no such thing as shaking people out of their ideology. And so to Maeve's point about this theme, they can bend every development. And even when they're proven categorically wrong about the thing they just staked their life on, it doesn't matter because their ideology is what defines what is real and what is not.
Yeah. Yeah. And this podcast I listened to, this woman bet her son tricked her into making a series of bets about events that her Q prophesized happening. She lost $700.
Wow.
Because none of it happened. And yet she was not moved at all.
No.
Wow.
But she did say she would be making no more bets.
Right.
We are living in a really, I mean, you know, Amanda, you know this much better than I do, but like we are living in a distinctive moment because across the globe, we are seeing crises of ideology and belief where whole societies are sort of being divided between more fascistic elements like QAnon, like Donald Trump, and on the other hand, a desire to kind of hold on to some conception of democracy, right? Like, you know, as you mentioned earlier, not all ideology is bad, right? For example, democratic ideals are a form of ideology that we commit to, that we believe, that we fundamentally believe in. And then what we're living through is a world and a time in which we're like, why? And I think it's probably why we're all so like flabbergasted all the time. Like, how could it be that, you know, folks on the right are like, we don't give a shit about democracy. We just want our weird, charismatic, non-charismatic, like oaf to be in office who's going to just strip the country of any sort of even pretense of democratic ideals, right? Like we're facing a crisis precisely because we're being shown how fragile our ideology is and how much it can be subject, how dangerous it is to introduce these ideologies that are not logical or I mean, they're logical. They're internally logical, right? Like they make sense to themselves.
Well, and they make sense to what people who hold them want.
Yeah, but we can't live in the same society with them. So to go back to Durkheim's point, right? Like, and to some extent to go back to the sort of, I think one of the sort of premises of the episode is that Loki's conception of the universe and Mobius's conception of the universe are orthogonal with respect to one another. Yeah. They can't coexist exactly. So something has to shift. Change has to happen in some way. And we see that it's possible that Loki can influence Mobius. Mobius might think now Loki can change, but it's going to require, and I think what's being kind of set up for us, it's going to require a move away of these two figures from the Time Variance Authority, because the Time Variance Authority is not an organization that admits the possibility of change.
I mean, I somewhat disagree, maybe, but I think you have two characters being set up as opposite of each other. And I feel like we've been set up to believe that they're going to move towards each other. That Loki's going to have to admit that the world needs more order, and Mobius that the world needs more chaos.
Well, no, I agree with that. I 100% agree with that. I think, what's also being alluded to is the history of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
A particular branch of that, which says that when ideologies become too rigid.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Marxism, Leninism, right? If we think of those two bodies of thinking as conjoined, right? Marxism, Leninism was a fairly flexible philosophy of collective societies. The Soviets take it over. It becomes too rigid. It's about oppression. It's about discipline. It's about punishing all outsiders. It's against variance. It's against variation. And then Marxism, Leninism as an ideology dies out because it can't survive. I mean, it doesn't totally die out, but it dies out in that context. It doesn't survive inflexibility.
Yeah, and the TVA just seems to need to prune everything.
Yeah.
That doesn't.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, well, it's very religious, right? All the language around sacred timelines. Mobius talks about salvation. And I noticed in the recap of the last episode how many of the lines they pulled from the previous episode were the ones with very religiously loaded terminology. And if religion isn't the thing that's doing ideology that determines reality, well, folks, I don't know what is. Look, so if I'm following Maeve, you talked about how this episode's primary theme was this idea of ideology determining reality, that we saw this on the conversations again about, how Mobius and Loki see themselves and where they come from, but also Mobius and Ravonna Renslayer, and talking about time and how these things are constructed and their jobs and their roles with each other. You talked about Emil Durkheim and the idea that our shared beliefs actually are like the primary creator of our shared social reality, right? That we, the things we agree upon as a society, become true to us. And Amanda, you talked about how things like QAnon show the lengths to which people will go to bend reality to their ideology. That is a lot to chew on as these characters go their separate ways, because now Loki is off on his own with his, feminine counterpart, and Mobius and Loki will be separated for the first time in the series, and it'll be interesting to watch them deal with life without each other. I suspect their absence may make the heart grow fonder in both cases. If I can leave folks with my own little parting thought about the nature of this episode, I was struck by how many of the choices of the characters relied on issues of trust, and specifically trust without perfect information, what some might call, especially in a religious capacity, a leap of faith. Ravonna has to trust Mobius against her better instincts when it comes to Loki. In turn, Mobius has to trust Loki even though he knows Loki is going to get up to some shit. And in the end, Loki decides to trust Sylvie / his feminine counterpart, and he literally takes a leap of faith through a time door. He has no idea what's on the other side or what he's getting into. He only knows that he's trusting his instinct and making a leap of faith. We've talked a lot about Mobius's conversation about the timekeepers and how he believes in his own origin story, but that choice to believe is its own kind of leap of faith, while Loki trusts his instincts at every turn, especially when it comes to analyzing where and how he would behave. And all of this is in tension with doubt, right? Hunter B-15 is distrusting of Loki at every turn, taking away the knives, supervising him in the Roxcart store. And even Mobius with Loki and Pompeii is having some serious doubts as Loki's hopping up on that cart and doing his own things. The Pompeians themselves doubt Loki until the moment the volcano blows up, right? They're not willing to take a leap of faith that this guy in the weird outfit who jumps up on the cart is anything like approaching sane. And so, of course, if anyone, for whatever reason, had taken the irrational choice to believe him, maybe they could have outrun their fate and survived the unsurvivable, but we'll never know. So that's my takeaway about how I saw this little episode. Amanda, if people want to talk to you more about things like Order versus Chaos, where can they find and follow you?
Run free, my horned friends, to my Twitter account, which is Amanda Marcotte. And follow me at salon.com.
And Maeve, if people are interested in discussing more about the construction of our reality through ideology, where can they find and follow you?
Where I will encourage them to take leaps of faith rather than adopt a blind faith. You can find and follow me at Maeve Adams, MaeveAdams on Twitter. You can also read my academic writing at academia.edu.
All right, Audio Avengers, that is our show for today. We have a ton more Loki to discuss on PonderVision and CharacterCast, so keep your ears open for them on Saturday and Monday. Then, of course, we will be here on Thursday to talk about the next episode of Loki. If you are enjoying this show, please leave us that 5-star review on Apple so we can rise in those search rankings and more people can discover us. You can follow the Marvelous TV Club on Facebook. We're up over 2,000 folks there. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We've just gotten set up on there. It would mean a lot to us to get those follower counts up. If those are your platforms of choice, we'll post our clips there. We'll post some questions there. So talk to us. And if you want to follow me, of course, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm at Marc Faletti. That's Mark with a C, F like Frank, Aletti. All right, team, let's go pour out a juice box on the sacred timeline, shall we?